Every generation of New York has had its 9/11 scale challenges, be it a civil conflict boiled over into violence, a pathogen unleashed on an ill-prepared public, a natural disaster throwing municipal services into overburdened chaos, or, in the case we examine today, a fire. A fire which would sweep overnight through a city built of brick and wood, destroying more than 700 buildings, destroying so many homes and businesses that local insurance providers could not adequately pay out against claims, and all at the zenith of an unprecedented economic boom. The fire was so severe in its economic impact that it changed the direction of the city forever, both in its physical landscape and in its civil priorities. The Great Fire of December the 16th, 1835, a largely forgotten calamity, is as important to remember now as ever before. In 1835, New York was not the city that we think of when we think of New York today. None but church steeples stood over 5 stories tall. People commuted by way of horse-drawn wagons. Clothing was handmade. There were no department stores. Homes were lit by candlelight. Oysters were a staple food as ubiquitous as pizza today. The telegraph was an invention still in its development. No recording technology meant that music had to be experienced live, and some cultural experiences, like the opera, were only to be heard by those with the money for tickets, and in theaters with dress codes imposed as a barrier to the lower classes. There were no subways, no bridges, no tunnels, no phone lines, no Times Square, no sanitation department or garbage collection of any kind, no Grand Central, and no Statue of Liberty. In 1835, there were no social taboos against open racism and xenophobia, so people were vocal and unashamed of their hatreds. If you were the wrong race, you weren't allowed in certain places, including many churches. In 1830s New York, children died, and often. And if you were lucky enough to live a long life, you rarely died in a hospital setting, but in your home or in the street. There was also no modern scientific understanding of germs in those days, so if you died of tuberculosis or dropsy, it was reasoned that an all-seeing God had good reasons to want you dead. And if many were to die of, say, yellow fever or cholera, then that was God's punishment of a wicked society. There were also no guaranteed sources of clean and consistent water, nor easy access to them. But that would all change after the fire of 1835. Now, before the fire, the value of a home was in part determined by its proximity to clean water. But in a city that was growing in size with every boatload of Catholic immigrants that came to port, the assurance of accessible and potable water was diminishing. New York had, over the previous decade, experienced the largest population boom of any American city. The former governor, DeWitt Clinton, had made good on his grand scheme promise of building a canal to Lake Erie, the grandest engineering project yet undertaken in this new nation. A project which required lots of cheap labor, and in a time when neither bulldozers nor safety councils existed, Irish immigrants were of great utility as a labor resource to be exploited. Slavery had only recently been fully abolished in New York. In the North, slavery was a far less lucrative enterprise than in the Southern plantation economy, a contributing factor to its abolition. When slavery did exist in New York, slaves were mostly utilized in a domestic capacity, and many of the demands of building a city were simply too dangerous to risk the lives of slaves, who, though unpaid, were expensive property to feed and keep fit. It would be far cheaper to hire an Irishman. The Irish were arriving in New York daily, but with no property, no prospects, and no political voice. They were subject to the predation of Protestant landlords. And a substantial margin of Catholic immigrants couldn't read or write their own names. and they were fiercely resented by Protestant nativists, who viewed their presence as an insult to the spirit of their grandparents who had fought the American Revolution to be unburdened by Britain's problems, and to be free from the influences of the Pope and his myriad superstitions. The Erie Canal, built by Irish labor, enabled fast and easy trade, linking New York's harbor to the Mississippi River through the Great Lakes, in effect bypassing the Appalachian Mountains to reach the Western Territories. Consequently, trade was now a much cheaper enterprise. With the increased movement of goods over vast distances came the need for insurance, and insurance companies emerged like dandelions in the spring. Within 5 years of the Erie Canal's opening in 1825, New York's whirlwind port economy was the most lucrative enterprise in America. New York would now be known across America as the Empire State. And many Protestant merchants got rich, really rich. The Irish were otherwise left behind in the frenzy of opportunity. To protect themselves from further exploitation and discrimination, many had taken to forming and joining gangs which functioned along the lines of modern-day labor unions, where individual hardships could be consolidated into a singular political momentum. Many of these gangs found their way into the fabric of the city by embedding themselves into the city's fledgling municipal functions. Now, although the fire department, the FDNY, was officially chartered in 1798, there was no formal fire department as we know it today. There were no equipment regulations, and the equipment itself was primitive. Most fires were put out with hand pumps and men carrying buckets, nor were firefighters paid. Firefighters were strictly volunteers, and the local fire companies were not unified but in stark competition for access to a scarcity of water. The fire captains often rubbed elbows with city aldermen, mutually assuring each other's legitimacy and ascension through bribery. Fire companies often functioned as an extension of the territory disputes among rival gangs. The fire company's volunteer status made them easy prey to the financial influences of outside gangs. Often, burning homes would be raided of stored valuables, confiscated as payment for the service of putting out the fire, the spoils inevitably finding their way into the hands of gang leaders. Fire companies also greased the palms of local insurance companies to include their services on specific policies in specific districts, on specific blocks.
And may I point out that this area is the province of my own America's Fire Brigade, and that you lot belong only in the Bowery.
The policyholder would have affixed to their building something called a fire marker, which was an insignia of the chosen fire company, which would assure priority to the policyholder in the event of a fire, that their home be saved foremost. These emblems also served as a deterrent to thieves and arsonists, who would have to answer directly to the fire company, who would have a dozen or more burly and rowdy men in their employ. The oncoming winter of 1835 to 1836 would prove to be an historically cold and unforgiving one. By the 14th of December, 1835, firefighters had been called out into the freezing night to battle two major conflagrations. Although the fires were brought under control, the cisterns had all but been drained, and unable to be replenished as local groundwater had frozen solid. 2 nights later, on the evening of the 16th, a polar vortex struck New York, and blistering winds sent New Yorkers deep indoors. And every stove and furnace in the city was burning wood and coal uninterrupted throughout the night. Unsurprisingly, a fire broke out at what is now Beaver Street near its intersection with Hanover Square, and this fire was much more severe and quickly spread to neighboring buildings as freezing gale-force winds quickly whipped up embers, trailing them across the street onto yet more buildings. Alarm bells roused people into the cold streets, where murmuring crowds whipped up strange rumors as fast as the flames themselves. The commotion in the glowing skies quickly caught the attention of the saloon dwellers in the 5 Points, a quarter-mile to the north, and teams of men were amassed, sauntering downtown toward the inferno, with empty knapsacks and overcoats, like ants crawling toward a picnic. The rival fire companies, tired from the previous nights of ceaseless alarms, no longer afforded the luxury of competition, attempted to access the fire plugs, primitive hydrants fed by the city's cisterns. But the water within them had frozen stiff, and the cisterns largely empty from the previous days of firefighting. The firemen, unwilling to admit defeat, quickly mobilized men who ran toward the East River to drill into the ice in hopes to suck up water. But the ice refroze around their primitive hoses, effectively sealing them shut. It was quickly realized that the blaze was a lost cause, and thereafter the public saw an opportunity. The burly men of the 5 Points emerged from the curious crowds and hurled themselves headlong into burning buildings, supply houses, saloons, apothecaries. They ran off with jewelry, paintings, crucifixes, anything of value that they can get their hands on. The fire was a blessing to some among the rowdy mob, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to loot with impunity. Near South Street, a man was caught attempting to start yet another fire. He was quickly surrounded and beaten to death by a mob of grieving merchants. His body hung from a tree as a warning to other looters and left aloft for 3 days before the city took it down. By 1 a.m., the fire raged so intensely that embers began to cross the East River and fall into the streets of Brooklyn Heights. The next efforts were made to deprive the fire by demolishing adjacent buildings, yet no immediate access to the required quantities of gunpowder were readily available on Manhattan Island. By 3 a.m., the U.S. Marines had been able to muster a shipment of gunpowder from the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a normally easily accessible asset now thwarted by a nearly impregnable river of ice. By this time, the flames had become so ravenous that they could be seen from Philadelphia, some 80 miles to the south, where efforts were now underway by the fire companies there to make their way north to New York. Though by the time of their arrival the next day, the damage was done. The fire had fizzled out shortly after sunrise, and when the smoke cleared and the unforgiving winter morning dawned, 13 acres of the most economically significant real estate in America were in ashes. 17 blocks of Lower Manhattan, over 700 buildings, gone. Most notably, New York City's post office and the New York Stock Exchange. Only 5 buildings within the path of the flames had been spared. Although the city was in ruins, the people weren't. As was the case after 9/11 and Hurricane Sandy, the people of New York have a strange history of stoic resolve. The sentiment is best described in this account given by a British newspaper in the days following the disaster.
The fire raged incessantly for upwards of 15 hours. The shipping along the line of wharves suffered considerably. Several vessels were entirely destroyed. The property consumed is estimated at $20 million, and in the midst of this terrible visitation, however, it is consolatory to see the elastic energy of the people. Instead of wasting their time in despondency over this frightful desolation, the whole population seems on the alert to repair the mischief. Plans of rebuilding on an improved scale and modes of borrowing money for that purpose on sound securities are under arrangement. The energy of the inhabitants and the ready manner in which the banks had offered to make advances to the different insurance companies, as well as to private individuals, would avert the commercial crisis.
In the aftermath, 23 out of 26 New York-based insurance companies were out of business. Subsequently, emergent insurance companies saw great risk in providing coverage to businesses neighboring their own offices. So a new trend among insurance providers for New York was to incorporate far away in Hartford, Connecticut, a city some 125 miles to the north, free from whatever calamity might befall the city in the future. Consequently, Hartford, Connecticut would become known as the insurance capital of America, a distinction it holds to this very day. The streets were rebuilt in a quick manner, but redesigned to accommodate broader traffic, and the city began imposing building regulations that are still upheld to this day, that no structure henceforth built in New York ever be built of wood. Although local companies would not be fully compensated for their losses, there was one exception, perhaps the most amazing story in this whole disaster. Two brothers, whose story is one of New York's greatest ironies, Arthur and Lewis Tappan, the Tappan brothers. They had moved to New York from Massachusetts in 1826 after the Erie Canal opened, and they opened a silk importing business, which became successful. A third brother, Benjamin Tappan, had become a U.S. Senator, so the family was rather well suited to upward mobility. But rather than enriching themselves financially, the Tappans, devout Christian Calvinists, saw their acquired wealth as a means to promote their religious evangelism and moral authority. They never relented in their preachiness and were resolute in their expectations of those they did business with or employed. To work for the Tappans meant that you had to show up to work in approved attire, and you were required to pray with them. They quickly made a reputation for themselves as insufferably pious. Their use of their economic status as a pulpit in the most secular and opportunistic city in America made them unpopular, particularly among the Irish. Years before Henry Ward Beecher preached of abolition of slavery from his Brooklyn church, the Tappans had made a spectacle of themselves as militant abolitionists. Arthur Tappan would go on to become the president of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Now, although slavery had been abolished officially in New York in 1827, plenty of people were still getting rich off their dealings with southern cotton-producing states, and even still making big money on the physical trading of slaves. The Tappans never held back in their ambitions for emancipation on a national scale. This made them plenty of enemies. In fact, in 1831, Arthur Tappan's summer home in Connecticut was burnt to the ground by a pro-slavery mob, but the Tappans could not be intimidated. In 1834, during the abolition riots, just a year before the fire, their silk exchange on Pearl Street was looted, employees were threatened, and property was vandalized, and thereafter routinely until the fire. Such was the liability associated with their rhetoric that no local insurance company would ever agree to underwriting any policy for the Tappans. So they looked elsewhere, ultimately settling on an insurance policy from an insurer based out of Boston. After New York burnt to the ground, the only business downtown that got a full payout against damages was the Tappans. They suffered no financial burden whatsoever. Lewis Tappan would later, in 1839, be contracted as part of the legal team in the famous Amistad case. So if you've ever seen the movie Amistad, then you're already at least passably familiar with the Tappans. The fire's most important consequence of all was the implementation of a new infrastructural enterprise as ambitious in its scope as the Erie Canal was a decade earlier. A water management system unseen since the Roman Empire, an aqueduct. Engineered through Roman principles with modern touches, the Croton Aqueduct today diverts 21,000 Olympic pools worth of water into this city every day, from an array of reservoirs located in the upstate Catskill Mountains. Not only would New York be able to guarantee clean and renewable water, but the water pressure caused by gravity would now enable a new class of firemen to fight blazes more effectively and allow for buildings to be built taller. A few years after the fire, a famine began to plague Ireland, and thousands upon thousands more Irish flooded into New York, scaring the Protestant elites from their Cherry Street townhouses and Richmond Hill estates. And now, free from dependence on local water sources, the wealthy moved elsewhere, into new mansions, replete with full modern plumbing fixtures and flushing toilets. By the 1840s, they had congregated into purpose-built neighborhoods like Gramercy, as well as a modernized and faraway thoroughfare in the heart of the new numerical grid system. A parade of mansions, known as the Millionaire's Row, today called simply Fifth Avenue. The poor Catholics stayed poor and Catholic, with little access to the high rollers' economy for the next 30 years, though by 1855, Irish populism elected the first pro-Irish mayor, Fernando Wood, who rewarded gangs with badges and guns and other high-status municipal positions as a favor for their exuberance in rousing the public into the voting booths. By 1865, at the close of the war, the fire department finally began paying salaries to its firefighters, thus minimizing their allegiances to outside gangs. Most incredible of all in this story of a fire so big is the minimal loss of life. An investigation into the Great Fire of December the 16th, 1835, was determined that an overburdened gas pipe was the likely culprit, but no official blame was ever leveled, and no individual nor institution was ever held to any account.